Hey everybody, tonight's video is called The Details of God's Wrath, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Lamentations, where we're looking at the details of God's wrath for Jerusalem and Edom. And I just want to give you a full warning to be prepared to see the most vivid portrayal of Judah's agonies, the lamenting Zion punishment, but we're going to see the assurance that the punishment will cease. So you might be like, how is this any feel good in this? Like, Lamentations 3 was like, all right, it was getting better there. We get to see God's love and compassion and mercy, and now we're back to judgment and agony. Like, what are you doing to me? But, you know, this is how Lamentations chapter 4 moves back into. So Lamentations chapter 4, verse 1 and 2 says, how the gold has become dim, how changed the fine gold. The stones of the sanctuary are scattered at the head of every street. The precious sons of Zion, valuable as fine gold, how they are regarded as clay pots, the works of the hands of the potter. So the gold adornment of the temple, looted by the conquerors, lost its luster with a coating of dust where they scattered the remains. And the gold and the rich furnishings had been laid waste by King Nebuchadnezzar, as found back in 2 Kings 25 verse 9. In Jeremiah, we see he lamented the loss of the precious sons of Zion, who were valuable as fine gold. The best and the brightest were all taken from Judah and Jerusalem, and only the poorest and least able were left behind. And the generation lost to Babylon would never be as valued as they would be in Jerusalem. And they were cheap and lowly regarded like clay pots. In verse 3 through 5 says, even the jackals present their breasts to nurse their young, but the daughter of my people is cruel. Like ostriches in the wilderness, the tongue of the infant clings to the root of its mouth for thirst. The young children ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. Those who ate delicacies are desolate in the streets. Those who were brought up in scarlet embrace ash heaps. So even worthless jackals by the nature nurse their young, but under the severities of conquest, Israelite women were unable to nurse their babies. And birds, which are notable for ignoring their young, as in ostriches, as Job spoke about in Job 39 verse 14 through 16, under the enormous stress of the siege, the people of Jerusalem did not care for their children. And no one was safe from the judgment that came upon Jerusalem. And those once high were brought very low. And in verse 6 here, it says, the punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment with no hand to help her. So we know the sin of Sodom ultimately was pride and homosexuality. The fact that the suffering of Jerusalem was prolonged while that of even Sodom was swift marks it as a greater judgment. And you probably know the verse in 1 Peter 2. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now. 1 Peter 4:17 it is, where judgment begins with the house of God. And the prophets often use Sodom as an archetype of divine judgment of sin, as you find across the Old Testament in Deuteronomy 29:23, Isaiah 1:9, Jeremiah 23:14, Ezekiel 16:46, Hosea 11 verse 8, and Amos chapter 4 verse 12. And the destruction of Jerusalem was due to the iniquity of God's people. And Ezekiel, as we're going to see in our next study here coming up, we move into Ezekiel actually on Monday or Tuesday, whatever. We'll see in February that the sin of Jerusalem was worse than that of Sodom. And we'll see how the prophet speaks on that. And sometimes we get caught up on Sodom and Gomorrah, but their sin was considered worse. And we'll see in February for that part to continue. But verse 7 through 10, it says, her Nazarites were brighter than snow and whiter than milk. They were more ruddy in body than rubies, like sapphire, in their appearance. Now their appearance is blacker than soot. They go unrecognized in the streets. Their skin clings to their bones. It has become as dry as wood. Those slain by the sword are better off than those who die of hunger. For these pine away, stricken for the lack of fruits of the field. The hands of the compassionate woman have cooked their own children. They became food for them in the destruction of the daughter of my people. You're like, say what? So those who were the purest, most devout, strong, healthy, and noble of the people, because they became dirty, weak, and dishonorable. And the people's misery is desperate and wretched. And death by famine is not an instant judgment, and it's lingering. It exposes the horrors of God's judgment to a dreadful degree. And in verse 10 is the say what verse. Jeremiah repeatedly rebuked the people's sin of child sacrifice before the fall of Jerusalem. Therefore, in an awful way, the punishment fits the crime. And we see that in the famine, that the hands of the compassionate woman have cooked their own children. When mankind is desperate, we become the unthinkable. And today, we see child sacrifice obviously through abortion. It's for reasons of convenience, financial reasons as well. In verse 11 through 13 says, the Lord has fulfilled his fury. He has poured out his fierce anger. He kindled a fire in Zion, and it has devoured its foundations. The kings of the earth and all the inhabitants of the world would not have believed that the adversary and the enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. Because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed in her midst the blood of the just. So the focus here returns to God's wrath. Judah's sin and the Lord's righteous punishment provides an explanation for all the ills that the people are suffering. And the doom of Zion was appropriate given the sins of the spiritual leaders as they murdered the faithful prophets of the Lord and the people of God. In verse 14-15, they wandered blind in the streets. They have defiled themselves with blood so that no one would touch their garments. They cried out to them, go away, unclean, go away, do not touch us. When they fled and wandered, those among the nations said, they shall no longer dwell here. So by the complicity of the sins of others, the priests and the prophets have become defiled, and the people chased the false leaders away. And earlier, we know that the people embraced the false teachers. They welcomed the false prophets in their message of peace, and now they shun them like lepers. And the curse of Deuteronomy 28 verse 65 through 66 is fulfilled as such. And Jeremiah pictured the people of Jerusalem wandering blind through the streets, stepping on dead bodies and therefore defiling themselves. In verse 16-17 it says, the face of the Lord scattered them. He no longer regards them. The people do not respect the priests, nor show favor to the elders. Still our eyes failed us, watching vainly for our help. In our watching we watched for a nation that could not save us. So the face of the Lord was symbolic in the Bible for divine anger. And the Jews had to face up to God, and the scattered people from Jerusalem weren't welcome in the other places or nations. And Judah's false prophets and leaders put their trust in man. They put their trust in Egypt to rescue them from the Babylonians. but they watched vainly for help. In verse 18 through 20, they tracked our steps so we could not walk in our streets. Our end was near, our days were over, for our end had come. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles of the heavens. They pursued us on the mountains and lay in wait for us in the wilderness. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Lord, was caught in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. So when the remnant tried to escape Jerusalem after its walls were breached, there was nowhere safe to run. In verse 20, the breath of our nostrils was a term for God. He is our life giver. And when Jerusalem was finally conquered and occupied by the Babylonians, the Jewish citizens had very little freedom, and they were soon prepared for exile for Babylon. And Jeremiah has long prophesied that the Babylonians would conquer Jerusalem and Judah. And now finally the time had come for that to take place, and their days were over. And anyone who tried to escape was captured, such as we saw back in Jeremiah chapter 52, verse 5 through 11, when we looked at that on New Year's Eve to close out the book of Jeremiah in regards to King Zedekiah. King Zedekiah was an example how he tried to flee, but the Babylonians got him. In verse 21-22, rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz. The cup shall also pass over to you, and you shall become drunk and make yourself naked. The punishment of your iniquity is accomplished. O daughter of Zion, he will no longer send you into captivity. He will punish your iniquity, O daughter of Edom. He will uncover your sins. So, in effect, God is pretty much saying in verses 21-22, laugh all you want right now. Your judgment's going to come. And Edom was a historic enemy of Israel who aided the Babylonians in their assault against God's people in Jerusalem and turned over fugitives, as seen in Obadiah verse 14, and will be in Obadiah later in the summer, I think it is. In Edom, it was another name for Jacob's brother Esau, as found in Genesis 25 verse 30. So to wrap up today's video, we're keeping this short, as I know the last one hit a half hour or whatever on Tuesday. We look tonight at the punishment of the daughter of Zion with the dim gold of Zion. And in verse 3-5, we saw the cruelty of Zion's depravation. And verse 6 is the greatness of Zion's punishment. And we saw that Zion's punishment was compared to that as in Sodom. And I want to look at Luke chapter 17 and verse 28-30. Says, likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sowed, they planted, and they built. But on the day of Lot, that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So Jesus also used Sodom, speaking of the coming kingdom, reflecting Genesis 19. In Lamentations 4:7-10 shows us that the stricken people of Zion. In verse 11-13 shows the Lord's fury against the sins of his people. In verse 14-17, we see the daughter of Zion and the nations are scattered by the fate of the Lord. In verse 18-20, pursued by the enemies of God's people. And then we see that the chapter ends with the judgment coming to Edom. And that's going to wrap up our video for today. We'll see you next tomorrow as we are going to close out our first book of 2025 in the book of Lamentations, looking at the desolation to hope for restoration. So I hope that you can join us as we close out another study. And I hope that you have a great rest of your evening. Have a great weekend ahead. God bless.